So when Bob and Linda asked me to come and teach, they said, we want you to do a real in-depth teaching from the Torah portion. And because it's Tuesday, it's really kind of in the middle of the week. So I could choose this past week's or next week's. I choose this past week's because there's so much in Va'etchanan, which is begins Deuteronomy something, Deuteronomy 3, verse 23. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I actually want to talk about the first verses in the Torah portion, and we're going to dig, and we're going to do a lot of textual analysis, and I hope you'll enjoy and work with this with me. Okay? So now my Bible's in Hebrew, so if I'm going to read the text, if anybody wants to read the text in English, that's great. Otherwise, I'll just kind of loosely translate it. Unless you want to give me an English translation that I would read from. But whatever, it doesn't matter. Anyway, the portion begins where God, don't forget, we're in the middle, we're in Deuteronomy. We are in the middle of Moses' first speech. The whole book of Deuteronomy is Moses' speeches to the nation given in the last few weeks before he dies. And these speeches are all speeches that are summarizing things that Moses believes the nation needs to hear and understand before they enter the land of Israel. So it includes a recap of history, and it includes key commandments that he wants to make sure they understand. Warnings, make sure not to go, follow idol pagan worship, all kinds of stuff like that. Some of these talks recap events that have already happened, and in this first speech, it's very often referred to as the historical speech, because most of this first speech is recapping events, some which took place, a few decades earlier, some took place just a few weeks earlier. Okay? So here we're in the middle of the speech, and it begins as Father says, "And I plead to the Lord at that time, saying." And it begins a prayer that Moses is giving, he's telling the nation, this is what I did. At that time, and in a minute we'll talk about what that time was. At that time, I prayed to God, and he then has this plea from God to let him go into the land of Israel. As you remember, Moses sinned. When did he sin? He sinned they came to that area where there was no water, and God and the nation is clamoring for water, and God says to Moses, "Take your staff and speak to the rock, and water shall come forward." And instead, he went and he hit the rock. It's not clear if that was the problem or no. I don't want to discuss that. That's a whole nother Bible lesson. Exactly what was the problem there, but as a result, God says to Moses, "Because you did not sanctify me, because you didn't believe enough to sanctify my name," he then punishes Moses and Aaron, telling them they are not going to come into the land of Israel. Now that particular sin actually had taken place not that long before this. It's also in that last year before they go into the land of Israel. I don't know if you realize that in the middle of the book of Numbers, somewhere around chapter, I'll tell you exactly where, somewhere around chapter 18, 19, something like that. It's probably in the middle of chapter 19. We suddenly have 38 years go by. Until that point, the Bible is, not the Bible, but from Exodus, okay, from the Exodus, in the middle of Exodus, until Numbers around chapter 19, we are talking about the first 2 years in the desert, okay? From chapter 19, we fast forward, and we're the last year before they go into the land of Israel. So there's like 38 years there that we don't know anything about. Actually, and I'll just throw this at you. What is Numbers 19? How does it begin? Numbers 19 begins with the laws having to do with the red heifer. Okay, and what is the red heifer for? It's to purify there's different kinds of impurities that biblical impurities that you have to then purify yourself before you can come to the temple, before you come before God. And the most serious of these impurities is death. Somebody who has come in contact with a dead person, the purification of that to enable them to then go to the temple, bring a sacrifice or whatever, that is purified through the use of the ashes of the red heifer. Okay, I once heard a brilliant statement. I think it's brilliant. You have a missing 38 years right there, right? You have and then all of a sudden we don't know. We're in the last year. What happened in those 38 years? The laws of the red heifer. They were dealing with death. For 38 years, people were dying. A whole generation died off in 38 years. And the Bible doesn't tell us anything about those years except the laws of the red heifer. I think that's like brilliant. You say, what happened? Those death. Okay. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about tonight, but I had to share that with you because I think it's so powerful. Anyway, so what happens? We're talking today about this. So we're in the final year. We're in the final weeks after. Deuteronomy is very specific. We're in the last weeks before Moses dies, and Moses is telling them that he was pleading with God to let him come into the land. He says, "Please," verse 25. Please let me pass into the land. Let me see the good land and the other side of the Jordan, the good mountain, this good mountain, and the Lebanon. And then what does he say? He says, and the Lord was angry. Now, what does it say in the English? The Lord was angry
with me on account of you.
On account of you. Okay. Bad translation.
Okay.
Bad translation. Okay. Now, I'm going to ask you something else. Go back to Deuteronomy 1, verse 37.
What was the reference?
Deuteronomy 1, 37. Now, read me the first few words.
You want me to read?
Yeah.
Also, because of you, Adonai was angry with me and said, you too will not go in there.
Also what? Because of you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, on account of you and because of you are really the same thing. Okay? That's an accurate translation for Deuteronomy 1:37. There, Moses is recounting the sin of the spies. And he says, as a result of the sin of the spies, you're punished and you can't go into the land. Of course, he's referring to their parents, the previous generation. Okay? And then he says, and also God was angry with me and he wouldn't let me go in because of you. Now, Moses isn't punished because of the spies, but he is punished, and what basically he's saying, because of the mess up I had with you and you're clamoring for water and you got me so crazy and I hit the rock and whatever, okay? He says, it's all your fault that I'm also punished. That makes sense in Deuteronomy 1:37. In Deuteronomy 3:26, the word in Hebrew is lema'anchem, which doesn't mean because of you, it means for your sake. God was angry at me for your sake. Now, we're going to come back to that because the understanding what that means is going to be critical to what we're going to be studying tonight in this whole situation. Okay? Anyway, the end of the story is Moses is saying, God didn't listen to me. And he said, stop talking to me about this. I've had enough of this. And then what does he say? He says, go up to the top of the mountain and look out from all directions. And he's basically saying, you're going to go up to this mountain and you're not going to be able to enter the land, but you're going to be able to view the land from the mountain. And we know that this takes place at the end of Deuteronomy, when actually Moses goes up, when he dies and he is able to see. The very end of this chapter, he then says, and command Joshua, strengthen him and give him courage, for he will pass before this nation. He will conquer the land or divide the land, this land which you are now seeing, okay, which you will see. The last verse of this chapter is, we sat in the valley opposite the house of Peor. Okay? Now, do you remember what Peor is? The Baal Peor, do you remember what that was? That was a terrible, terrible situation where the nation sinned grievously, and it actually happens just a few weeks earlier, okay? They are in this valley, and then the Midianites and the Moabites send these women, prostitutes, to seduce the men, and they sin, and then there's this terrible plague. 24,000 Israelites are killed by God, until finally Phinehas gets up and he stabs this couple who were particularly brazen, okay, and then the plague stops. Okay, so this is the background, and here it doesn't tell the story. It just says, and by the way, we were sitting in that valley, almost kind of reminding the nation, this is the background here. Okay, we're in the background. One of the basic questions that comes up when we study these few verses is, when did this happen? This is the only time that we have mentioned that Moses came back to God and pleaded with him to allow him to go into the land. We don't, when these stories are told in Numbers, which is when the things happen and we have the account of it, there's no mention anywhere of this prayer. So when did it really happen? How can we fit this in, and how can we figure that out? Okay, so that's a question that we're going to be dealing with, and I'm going to be going back and comparing what we have here with the text in Numbers and fit it in and see what we learn from fitting it in that way. But before we get to that, I want to share with you a midrash. Do you know what a midrash is? Okay, for those of you who may not know, midrashic literature is essentially stories. Okay, not always, but a lot of it is stories. And these are stories that were initially told or recorded going back to the 1st and 2nd centuries. Most of them were then either recorded in the Talmud, which was, let's say, completed by the 5th century, or even later in different compilations of midrashic stories and commentary that can be as late as the 10th century, okay? It's a whole body of literature spread over different books with very similar styles. And they're different stories, they have served different functions. But the kind of midrash this is, the kind of stories that I'm going to share with you today are essentially stories that kind of fill in the blanks at some of the stories that we're reading in the Bible. They use the biblical story as a jumping off point to then tell an additional story. The story itself is not something, it's not written in the Bible, so we can't say it actually happened. It may have happened, it may not have happened. Some of these stories are traditions that really go back thousands of years, way before they were ever recorded. These are stories that were passed down from generation to generation. But the function of these stories is either to, through a story, provide a commentary on a biblical passage, or to convey a message, a teaching of some sort, and sometimes both, okay? So I found a very interesting, in the same midrash, it's called the Midrash Tanchuma, I found two different stories that kind of flesh out this little passage here about Moses' prayer, which I think is very interesting in and of itself, because it gives us an understanding also about the limits of prayer or something like that I want to share with you. It also will give you a sense of what is this midrashic literature, what's the style, what's going on. Okay, so the first one, it starts as follows. We know what the text of the prayer is here, so this is kind of fleshing it out more. And he says, okay, God, this is Moses talking to God. He says, Almighty God, everybody is the same to you. You treat the innocent and the evil in exactly the same way. He's accusing God of something incredibly serious. He's saying, the spies sinned because they slandered the land. But I, who was a loyal servant for 40 years, shepherding your nation through the desert, you treat both of us the same way. neither of us can enter the land. He's accusing God of being unfair and unjust, okay? And then the Midrash goes on to say, he gives a story as a kind of like a story that, kind of fairy tale kind of story, but that illustrates the point. He says, what is this like? He says, it's like a king. A king has, king wants to marry a woman, and he sends messengers out to find him. He heard that there's a woman somewhere who's worthy to be queen, and he sends his messengers out to go check out this woman, make the arrangements. And the messengers come back, and so the king says, so what'd you find? How was this woman? And the messenger said, oh, you have never seen an uglier woman. Terrible. Okay? And meanwhile, there's this advisor to the king who didn't go out with the messengers. And the advisor says, no, she's a beautiful woman. There's no problem. You can marry her. The king says, okay, I'll listen to my advisor. And they send back the messengers to go bring the wife. And when he gets there, meanwhile, the father of the girl hears about what these messengers had said to the king about his daughter. And he says, no way I'm letting you into my palace. I heard what you said about the daughter. So then the advisor to the king comes, and he says, well, what about me? You can't let me in? I said good things about you. No, I'm not letting any of you in. And so it was with God and Moses. The ending of this is basically God, again, Moses says to God, this isn't fair. You're treating the good guys and me the good guy, and those bad guys in the very same way. Why did I sin? I defended your land when these spies came back, and I'm not getting any credit for that? Why are you treating me the same way? This story is a very, very powerful story because it also says something to us about prayer. This story is not shrinking from the idea of man being able to ask God, where's the justice in all of this? There is complete legitimacy in this. The message here is, I think, a very powerful one. Gives complete legitimacy for man to rail at God and say, where's the justice? Then it goes on to a second story that has a little bit of a different kind of thing. And here, the next midrash takes the word Va'etchanan, which means, and I pleaded. And he says, well, what does this word really mean? And typically in a midrash, when it starts asking what a word means, it doesn't necessarily delve into the literal meaning of the word, but it kind of finds associations connected with that word. In this case, the midrash lists many different words that have been used in the Bible to talk about prayer. And then it says, well, why does it use this word? Now, in basic Hebrew, we know this word Va'etchanan means plead. So you can cry, you can plead, you can pray. There's all these kind of words that can be used to pray. But the Midrash doesn't say because it means plead. It takes a similar word, a word that means free. Okay? Free. No cost. No cost. Okay? No payment. And he basically says, the Midrash then says, why does Moses use this word? Because he's coming before God with utter humility and saying, please, I know I don't deserve it. I'm asking you for a freebie. Let me go into the land just because you're giving it to me, not because I deserve it. So you see, the same Midrash has two opposite messages, in a way. One message is saying, Moses rails at God. He believes he deserved to go in and that God was treating him unfairly. And the second Midrash says Moses comes with total humility saying, I recognize that I am not worthy, but let me go in anyway. Okay? And we're going to come back. I think also this is another way that you can look at prayer. This is the kind of prayer that we usually taught. Come before God in humility. Come before God realizing God is all-encompassing, all-powering, and we who come as ordinary human beings, how can we possibly say to God, gimme, 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 because I deserve it. Two different kinds of prayer, but I think it's brilliant and it's very important, very profound that we as human beings understand that we should be coming before God in humility, but yet there's a space for you to come before God when you have a complaint, when you see what you think is injustice, okay? And we're going to get back to what that means afterwards. But now I want to go back to the original question I posed, and that is, where does this section of Deuteronomy fit in with the stories that we heard as the original story was recounted in the book of Numbers? So let's go back to the book of Numbers, and here, if you want, you can follow along, but let me just summarize. I think it'll be simpler if I just summarize what we're doing. First of all, let's see the context. In Deuteronomy, the verse we just read, it begins by saying, and I prayed to God, or I pleaded with God at that time, okay? So, of course, the first question that we have is, what's that time? What time are we talking about? So if we look at the order of events in Moses' speech in Deuteronomy, we have the following. He talks about the spies, and he talks about the punishment of the spies. Then he goes into the progress that the children of Israel made just recently as they going through what is now Jordan. Okay, they have to bypass Edom, Moab, and Ammon. There's a war with the Amorites. There's a war with the Bashan, okay, which they win. Then he talks about the fact that Joshua is appointed as a successor. Then we have his recounting of his prayer to God. And finally, God is saying to him, go up on the mountain, and instead of going into the land, you're going to be able to see the land. That's the order of events as they are told in Deuteronomy. Now let's go back to the parallel events as they are recounted to us in the book of Numbers. And this is in book of Numbers for chapter 20, okay? So we begin with the sin of the rock and the water from the rock, okay? So what do we have there? We are again in a new generation, and the newer generation, the generation actually going to go into the land, and Moses sins, he loses his temper, he's upset, whatever it is that exactly happens, it is not pleasing to God. And clearly he loses his temper with the nation who's clamoring for water, okay? Then we have the issue of the bypassing Edom, the war with Amorites in the Bashan, just like we have here. Then we have the story of Balaam. Now keep in mind, the story of Balaam is probably not known to the children of Israel. There is no interaction between Balaam and the children of Israel. That's over there. We're told about it, but it's not something that the children of Israel are aware of. At least we have no knowledge that they're aware of it. So let's put that in parentheses. Then we have the story of the sin at Peor, that I was just telling you about, where they sent the prostitutes to lure the thing, and the terrible, what happened there. We have this terrible situation, and Moses is paralyzed. God sends a plague. Moses is paralyzed. He doesn't want to do, and it's Phinehas who comes up, and with his immediate action, the plague is stopped. Okay, keep that in mind. Then we go on, we have the story of the daughters of Slavchad, that's less important. And then we have God, like out of the blue really, not in response to something Moses said. God is saying, okay, Moses, go up on the mountain, look, and you're going to see exactly parallel to what we have here. Go up on the mountain, you're not going into the land, but look at the land from the mountain from afar. And right after that, Moses turns to God and says, please select my successor. Okay? What are the main differences here between the two accounts? In the account in Deuteronomy, Joshua's appointment as successor is told to us before Moses has his prayer. Okay? Whereas in Numbers, the appointment of Joshua is at the end of the story, after he's told to go up onto the mountain. Okay, it's a slight difference. Okay? Now, but if I combine the stories, all right, the only way to understand, if I take it as a given, God's command to Moses, you will go up on the mountain. Instead of going into the land, you're going to go up and view the land from afar. Okay? The prayer has to be right before that. That's the only place it fits in the original account in Numbers, okay? That's where it fits, okay? So now let's see what happens and I'd like to actually look at that verse in Numbers for a moment, because I think we see something fairly revealing there as well, okay? So in Numbers 27, verse 12, we have God saying to Moses, and here I'm going to ask you, Linda, if you can read just a few words. Numbers 27, verse 12. Read the first half of the scripture.
Adonai said to Moses, "Climb this mountain in the Arabim range."
Okay, fine. God said to Moses, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And he says the same thing. He says, because you sinned against me with the water and all that kind of thing, you're not going to go into the land, just go up and you'll see the land from the mountain. Then verse 15.
Moses said to Adonai.
Okay. You're missing here the fact that in the Hebrew, the word said uses two completely different verbs. Okay? In verse 12, it is the typical word for said, particularly when it's a word that used for said whether God speaks to Moses or Moses speaks to God. It's a very neutral, rather soft word. He said, I said to you, you said to me. It's not a word of command. It's not a word of harshness in any way, okay? In the Hebrew, though, it's very interesting. In verse 15, it says, Vayidaber. Moses spoke to God. That word is never used for Moses speaking to God. It has only ever been used for God speaking to Moses. And it's only used when, typically it's used where God speaks to Moses and says, this is a command, or command the children of Israel. In other words, if I were to accurately translate the word, I would say it instructs Moses, or speaks to Moses with the intention of instruction. It's a harsher word. Okay, speak rather than said. Speak in English also is a harsher word than said. But I would say in most contexts, it has the context of instruct. It's within the context of instruct. If you look at that, then, in this verse in Numbers, you have a very strange situation. Moses is instructing God. It's a little bit odd. There's a harshness there that is not usually present, okay? So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to put all these together and I'm going to take what we have here, okay? If I combine the prayer and the interchange between God and Moses that we have in Deuteronomy with the story as it is here related, I have the following. I have Moses beseeching God to let him go to the land, and God is angry. We have that in Deuteronomy, right? And I said I would go back to that. God was angry with me for your sake. I'm still going to get back to the for your sake, okay? God was angry with me for your sake. And then he says, go up onto the mountain. In return, after they go up to the mountain, go back to Deuteronomy 27, Numbers 27, Moses spoke to God harshly. It makes sense. God is angry at Moses, and Moses is angry at God. And Moses says, okay, you're not going to let me go? Then you need to appoint a leader who's going to do the right thing, okay? This is a harsh interchange. It's not a soft interchange. Whereas in Deuteronomy, even though we have that expression of anger, first of all, in Deuteronomy, Joshua has already been appointed. At least we're told. Joshua is the one who, at that time, around that time, he says, and this is in verse 21. And at that time, I commanded Joshua, saying, you've seen everything that God has done. You're going to go up. You're going to lead him. And then afterwards, in the context of going up to the mountain, God says, and command Joshua, strengthen him and give him courage. We don't have it as the original appointment. We have it just encourage Joshua in what will be his role. So the first question that I have, I think we have two things here. First of all, we suddenly have an angry exchange that goes two directions between God and Moses. Not just that God is angry at Moses, but Moses is kind of angry at God, or at least he's responding with a certain kind of anger or harshness in his voice. But the second thing is that we have Joshua in the Numbers account being, if we take this together, Joshua is being appointed as part of an angry exchange. Whereas in Deuteronomy, Joshua is appointed as a natural kind of thing. Okay? So now, what conclusions am I drawing from this? Okay? So first of all, the question we might add is, if the prayer was in Numbers, why is it not there? Why is this exchange not in Numbers? Why are we missing the prayer and the anger on part of God? Why are we only getting half the conversation? Okay? And then when we get it in Deuteronomy, we get only the anger from God. We don't have the anger from Moses. It's only when we put it together do we see this anger. So first of all, keep in mind that Numbers is the account of what happened that is more or less an account for posterity. We're the audience of Numbers. Numbers is not recited to the people of Israel. The people of Israel experienced Numbers, each with their own interpretation. They saw what they saw, they didn't saw what they didn't saw. The Numbers, the count in Numbers is given to us so that we, generations later, will have that account. Okay? But Deuteronomy is Moses speaking to the nation right here and then. It is critical in Deuteronomy that the appointment of Joshua not be seen as coming out of an angry exchange. The appointment of Joshua has to be calm, natural, because Joshua's going to be the leader. And you can't have any kind of situation where somebody will say, oh, he's not really a leader, it was an afterthought, it came out of an angry exchange, it was not really what should have happened, okay? Now, the truth of the matter is, if you go through in the book of Numbers, okay, basically what you see the picture, if you take the various events that happened in the book of Numbers as you're moving through, and I'll just review again where they were. We have Moses with the rock, okay, where he really failed there. His leadership failed there for the first time, okay, and then we have the sin at Peor, where Moses is paralyzed, and God is throwing this plague at the nation, and they're just dying like flies, and it's only Phinehas, who's the next generation, who acts, and then the plague stops. And then we see the daughters of Tzlevchad, I don't know how you say that in English, the daughters who came, they said their father died, and they don't have a territory, and they don't have inheritance, and Moses has no idea how to handle that. Until God says, listen to them, they're right. Moses, and this is an issue of inheritance. We're not talking about major issues of life and death. We are not talking about miracles. We are just talking about the kind of judgment a leader should make. Moses is speechless. And right after that, God sends him up, says, you're not going to go into the land, etc. What we're seeing, the picture that's painted for us in Numbers, is a picture of Moses, who's no longer a leader. Moses, who maybe doesn't know how to relate to this new generation. He loses his temper with them, with the rock and the water, and maybe he needed to be more patient with them because they're not his parents' generation that have sinned and fetched for 40 years. This is a new generation, and he's not attuned to that. He's part of the older generation. There's something incompatible with him and the leadership that is demanded at that time. And in fact, there are many commentators that look at this whole idea of what was the problem? Why was it that Moses could not go into the land of Israel? And if we go back to this verse that he says, and God was angry at me for your sake. There are many commentaries that say that for your sake means that it was for the sake of the nation that Moses couldn't go in. And there's two ways of looking at this. It could be because his leadership qualities are declining, and he's not appropriate for this generation, okay? And therefore, for the sake of the nation, they need another leader, okay? There's another approach that says that actually the relationship between God and the nation of Israel during the whole time in the desert, as represented by the relationship between God and Moses, is a relationship that is based on the supernatural more than anything else. They exist in a desert, no food and no water. God brings water from rocks, and he brings food from the heavens. And what does the scripture say? They didn't have to change their clothes because their clothes didn't wear out, and they didn't have to change their shoes because their shoes didn't wear out. That is not normal, okay? The existence of the nation of Israel in the desert for 40 years is a supernatural existence. And Moses was the leader for that, because Moses what does God say? Only Moses spoke face to face with me.
Yeah.
That's not a normal human being. Moses is way up there, okay? So Moses, in his relationship with God, he was the right leader for a supernatural existence. But when you're going into the land of Israel, you need Joshua. Don't forget, what's Joshua? Joshua is a general. He's a righteous man, but he's a general. It's going to be a whole different reality. So we have two different ways of looking at the fact that this would be for the nation's sake. I think also, if you look at the sin, this occurred to me like a few days ago. Where does, in Deuteronomy, at the end of chapter 3, Deuteronomy 3, the last sentence, and we were sitting in the valley opposite the house of Peor, as if it hinting to that terrible sin of Peor with sending those prostitutes, etc. And it occurred to me that maybe that sentence is a hint to the disastrous consequences of, at this stage of the game, having such an intimate relationship with God and that kind of a leadership. When they sin with idolatry, and immediately 24,000 people are killed. Now, let's go into the land of Israel. The nation goes into the land of Israel. Do you know how many times, you've read Judges. Joshua, the book of Joshua, that's 20 years approximately, and they're pretty good in that book, okay? Then you read the Judges, and you read Samuel, and you read Kings. Do you know how many times the nation sins with idolatry? Can you imagine if every time the nation sinned with idolatry, God would be sending plagues and tens of thousands would be killed at once? Would there be a nation of Israel left? There's something about coming to the land of Israel, and if we're going to stay and they're going to last a while there, requires perhaps God to be a little bit more removed from the nation. This might be a hard concept to grasp, but I liken it to the relationship with the Holy of Holies, okay? The high priest is the only one who can go into the Holy of Holies only one day a year, and it's an extremely dangerous thing. What happens when Aaron's sons went into the Holy of Holies, okay? They're immediately killed. And it's not even clear what they did wrong. They brought the extra incense. It's not even clear what happened there. But there's something there that, and what does God say to Aaron? He says, I become holy through those closest to me. There's something there about too much intimacy with God for people who are not on that level, burns, destroys, okay? And there's a realization here, as the nation is about to enter the land of Israel, we're going from the miraculous to the ordinary. You can't have a Moses-God kind of relationship in that thing. Everything will burn. It's too intense. It's too intense, this kind of relationship. We are moving from a Moses leadership to a Joshua leadership. Our sages say Moses is like the sun and Joshua is the moon. Okay, and that's also interesting because that brings me one of the interpretations of what Moses is actually asking for here in Deuteronomy is that he's asking for not to lead the nation into the land, but just let him go in as a normal citizen. Okay? Moses can't go in as a normal citizen. Because if Joshua's the moon, what happens in the daylight? When the moon is always there, by the way. But do you see the moon in the daylight? No. Why? Because the sun gets in the way. Okay? Moses can't go in alongside Joshua because Joshua's leadership will be completely eclipsed. It cannot happen. And you have that, I don't know, I was just talking to someone the other day who was telling me, a pastor, who was telling me in their denomination, the rule is when the pastor retires, he must leave the church. He cannot remain as a member, exactly for this reason. You know, you need to make sure you know who your leader is and not have somebody on the sidelines who's a competing thing. Okay, now, so basically, I want to also, though, go back to the two Midrash stories that I started with, okay? Because the two Midrash stories are saying two different but also similar things. I think in both cases, there's an admission that it is not necessarily logical. There's no logical reason presented in the Midrash for why Moses couldn't go in. There's a difference, though, in how that situation is accepted. In the first story, Moses is angry, and he's railing against that reality. And that would correspond to an understanding of Numbers 27 together with what we know from Deuteronomy 3, that it's a product of an angry exchange. Okay? That is essentially the way I look at the Midrash. What's the Midrash doing? It's basically doing what I just did. It's taking Deuteronomy 3, sticking it into Numbers 27, and suddenly seeing this conversation as an angry exchange between God and Moses. And the Midrash is fleshing out what is that angry exchange. And the angry exchange is basically Moses saying, this is not just. This is not fair. And there's no answer to it. That's Moses, God says, this is how it is, and Moses ends with, this is not just, and that's the end of the story. The second story has Moses saying, I don't deserve it, but please give it to me. And God says no. Okay? Now, we don't have a reason in the second story why God says no, you know. But what we have in the second story is an acceptance by Moses. It's essentially saying, I don't know why. I don't know why you said no. I don't know why you say yes. Because actually, I didn't go into the detail of the second Midrash, but the second Midrash actually goes further, and it says, God basically says to man, I don't owe man anything. If you do good, that's all very nice, but that doesn't mean I owe you something. If I give you something, I'm being nice, but I don't owe it to you. And so this is Moses. Then the understanding of the second Midrash is that Moses is still is saying this doesn't make sense in the world of reward and punishment. I did good, I should be rewarded. The difference is that Moses is saying in the second Midrash, I accept that I don't understand how God works. I accept that I may do things and I think maybe I deserve or do bad things, but we can't understand God's ways. He is way above us. And therefore I come with humility to God and I say, God, just give me a freebie. And so the difference here is not in how we understand why God didn't let Moses go in. The difference is how Moses accepted God's decision. In the first Midrash, he rails against it. In the second Midrash, he accepts it. And I think that these two Midrashim actually refer to the two different ways you can read the story. In Numbers 27, there's more of an angry exchange, especially if we take the extra information we have from Deuteronomy 3. In Deuteronomy 3, it's very calm. It's very accepting. Moses says, I pleaded. God didn't accept. You know, and then what does Moses say? God was angry at me for your sake. So then in Deuteronomy, Moses expresses the fact that he understands that in the end of the day, he can't go in for the sake of the nation. Is it just for him? Maybe not. But it's what needs to happen for the sake of the nation. He accepts the situation, and this is how it has to be. So that's a very long study. But I draw something from this in terms of how I see our relationship to the land of Israel, and especially if I go back to this notion of a Moses kind of leadership on the one hand, and another kind of leadership that is necessary for the nation as they go into the land. And I think this is something that I think teaches us a great deal as we deal with the land of Israel today. I don't know if you're aware, but, and I wonder if there wasn't a similar kind of discussion or debate within Christianity in response to the land of Israel, the state of Israel, in the same way there was in Jewish circles. And when Zionism began in the middle of the 19th century, there were many rabbis, particularly in Europe, who were against Zionism for a very simple reason. They said, the return to the land is supposed to happen in a miraculous way. It needs to be as a result of Messiah. And until Messiah comes on his white donkey and blowing his shofar, we're not going anywhere. Now, most of those rabbis ended up perishing in the Holocaust, and that certainly changed the way a lot of people saw things. But that was the original understanding. And then came the Zionists, who, for the most part, certainly in that time, were secular. They weren't even taking God into account. They were saying, God's not, we got to do this for ourselves. Jews are being persecuted in Israel. There's, terrible things going on. We have an opportunity that we've read the political situation, and there's an opportunity to do something. We have to do something. Now, a religious Zionist, and there were religious Zionists in those years, there were rabbis who did agree with the Zionists that we have to take initiatives. We don't have to wait for Messiah. Not because they didn't believe Messiah was coming, which is what the seculars believed, but they understood that there's an element of coming into the land of Israel that has to be based on the natural, that has to be based on human endeavor. And I think that if we go and we look at how the nation of Israel entered the land under Joshua, and I say this a lot to people, but it's suddenly I'm putting it together in the context of what we talked about tonight. If I read like Ezekiel 36, speaks to the mountains of Israel. It's one of the most beautiful chapters of redemption and return, restoration of Israel. Okay, what does God say? God said that He's going to the trees will shoot forth their branches, the cities will be rebuilt, the mountains will once again be resettled by human beings. Okay, it's a beautiful, beautiful picture of a restored land and people of Israel on the mountains of Israel. Okay. How is that going to happen? Now, based on that children of Israel existence in the desert, the way the food came from the heaven, you would say, okay, the houses come from the heaven. The trees come from the heaven. The people are sitting somewhere, I don't know, God says, beam them up, Scotty, like in Star Trek, right? And you end up in Israel. Okay. But when Joshua entered the land of Israel, there were no beam you up anybody's. Okay? The land became part of Israel because they went to war. And God did miracles. And in fact, it's a very interesting progression. If you read the book of Joshua, there is a progression from miracles that accompany the wars. Well, actually, Jericho is incredibly miraculous. But as the book progresses, there are fewer and fewer miracles and more battles, more and more politics, more and more ordinary human endeavor, because that's the transition from the Moses to the Joshua that we see played out before us in the book of Joshua. In our lifetime and today, I don't believe God is saying to us, sit back and wait for the events to unfold. Messiah is going to drop houses from the heavens. Are we hoping that one day we will be at that level of intimacy with God, that we will have a Moses or a Messiah, or that we'll have a temple? Of course. That is what we are aiming for. But we're not there yet. We're certainly not ready for that yet. That level of intimacy. You have so many people in Israel that don't even know if they believe in God or if they believe in God. That we're in a secular world. But again, if I go back and I take both the Joshua experience and I take Ezekiel 36, the only way to get started on this redemption business is to build the land and to go to the land in a physical way. And that doesn't mean railing against God. On the contrary, it means working with God. Because every single thing that we've witnessed in the rebirth and restoration of Israel has been miraculous. But not miraculous because we sat on our couch and we watched God wave some kind of wand. Miraculous because we were completely outnumbered in 1948. And we were still able to fight. We did what we could. We didn't have good weapons. We didn't have good planes. We did what we could, and God came and blessed our efforts. And that's the pattern. I see this coming back now to the land of Israel. It's got to be a physical coming back. And I say this, by the way, and dispute things I've heard, not so much by Israel supporters. You don't hear it there. But I know there are whisperings in the church of different types of Christians. And when they look at Israel, they're saying, what do they say about a redemption? They say it's a spiritual Israel. They'll say it's not in the ground. It's not on the earth. That is not true. The restoration of Israel is first and foremost physical, accompanied by spiritual underpinnings. And of course, we hope that we will get to a point and Messiah will come. And Jews and Christians both believe in Messiah with different visions of who and when and all that. But we don't have to go into that. But we believe that we're going to go to a more spiritual type of plane, but it has to be rooted in the physical. So that's what I wanted to share with you today from the Torah portion. And I do want to share a bit about our work, but before I do that, if any of you have any questions or any comments or challenges based upon the teaching I've done so far, this is your chance.
Can
Yes.
we first thank you for that lesson?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Yes,
I just really appreciate you sharing the midrash, if I'm saying that correctly.
you are.
Because as I learned to have my own walk with God, I can imagine that Moses could have very easily had both of those reactions that were shared, right?
Mhm.
That we start out being angry and saying that it's unfair, and then saying, oh, but I'm not God, and I can now see that your answer is no. And so I just don't know if that's something from a Jewish point of view that you
100%, yeah. And with Jewish point of view, very often you have multiple approaches in a midrash. And in a Jewish point of view, you can kind of carry all those multiple approaches at once. And you can say that there's disagreement. But I think there's elements of truth in all of them that you can also synthesize. And I think you've done that beautifully by saying, there's a... But I think, I personally, like I said, I think the fact that the Midrash gives us the freedom to rail against God. And I think too often people believe that that there isn't that space in our relationship with God. The key, though, is to come to the second Midrash, like you're saying, where at some point you say, look, I don't get it. It doesn't make sense to me. But at the end of the day, you're bigger. We have to submit and just say, okay, just give it to me for free then. I can't say I deserve it, but a freebie, and it's a whole different approach. Yeah. Yes?
Is the Midrash and the Jewish pseudegraphica the same thing? Or not? Do you know?
I thought the pseudegraphia are Second Temple writings. That's different. Which are not only Jewish. I mean, like, are you referring to like the Book of Jubilee and Ben Sira and those things? I think that's what's usually known. Apocrypha and the pseudegraphia, those are two types of writings that precede the Midrash. At least their recording is earlier than the Midrash. They are from the Second Temple period, and they're written by Jews, and many of them have been incorporated into a Catholic Bible, like the Apocryphas in the Catholic Bible. And over the years, there was, Jews didn't really know about them that much, and they rediscovered them only in modern times, but they are considered today to be Jewish books that were preserved in the Greek not in the Jewish, but that they were originally written probably in Hebrew and at some or in Aramaic, and got translated at some point to Greek. But those are earlier. But they're in many ways similar to the Midrash because they're also very story-based. But some of them, or a lot of them, are considered to be the product of cults that were very common in the Second Temple period, separating from what would have been normative Judaism. Like if you know anything about the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to be probably the product of an Essene cult that got really involved in the forces of darkness and evil and purity and all that kind of stuff. And it was like they took certain Jewish ideas and then took them to an extreme and were no longer part of the mainstream. And so some of these books would come from that. That's not what the Midrash is. The Midrash is recorded later, but reflects traditions that would have been, hanging around orally earlier, that would be more closely associated with the Pharisees during the Second Temple period, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So I have the perception that the Jewish people have great respect for Moses. Just, what a leader. What, his intimacy with God, his life, and it's just so highly respected. This particular lesson today gets to an aspect of Moses where perhaps he wasn't, just completely polished off and perfect. I'm wondering if the telling of this story, and I know that you will tell it, you will tell it like you read it, and call it like you see it. My real question is, are you a teacher who's willing to kind of give this kind of story, and would there be other rabbis and so forth that just wouldn't quite go there because they wouldn't want to take any chance of tarnishing a great man, truly a great man?
Okay, first of all, I love this question because what you have just did is put your finger on the pulse of something that was a raging debate within Orthodox Judaism in Israel, like in the past decade. Okay, really, this is it. Okay, so I study, and my rabbis are part of a tradition that would be very comfortable with this kind of analysis. This is the people that I've been studying with. And it's very important to say we are not ripping Moses apart. We feel very strongly that he was an amazing man, as close to God as man ever got. Okay, we say, there's a prayer that we say regularly that says there was never someone like Moses. Okay, it has never been since someone like Moses, that kind of prophet, that kind of person that was so close to God. So we believe that, and I believe that. But on the other hand, I'm reading a midrash that I didn't write. Right? This midrash is probably, at least in terms of from when it was recorded, is at least 1,500 years old. Okay, and the people who wrote it, these are very acceptable traditional sources. But at the same time, so I don't know. I think the midrash was doing exactly what I'm doing now. But over the years, I don't know. The raging debate was: can we look at figures in the Bible and bring them down and to human proportions and exercise character analysis, for example, when we discuss these images. So there are people saying, no, you can't do that because if they're in the Bible, they're like godlike. And for example, there's this is a classic. There's a debate in the Talmud. So this debate didn't start now. This goes back to the Talmud. Okay, in the Talmud, there's a debate where there are two different sages, and one that says, with reference to David and Bathsheba and that terrible sin, okay? One says, anyone who says that David sinned in that case, is a sinner themselves. And another one said, anyone who says he didn't sin, okay, is a sinner themselves. Okay? So there you have it. Now, at the end, you have these people that say, no, he sinned, David. But was the sin quite as bad as it was? And maybe there were extenuating circumstances. Okay, that becomes it. So, but what that comment says is, to what extent can we take a look at King David and look at him at eye level and say, you know, this was wrong? Because if your neighbor did something like that, you would just say unabashedly, this was wrong. Or do you put these people on some pedestal and say, yes, clearly there's a problem here, but we can't judge them because they're up there somewhere, okay? So I'm coming from the school of, yes, we can evaluate these people. That doesn't mean we put ourselves at the same level of these people. I'm no King David. I am certainly no Moses. Okay, these people are somewhere up there. But they're not God.
They're human.
They're human. And human beings, no matter how great they are, sin, and there's nothing wrong with saying that. And that's just how I look at it.
Isn't that how we have hope?
I agree. I agree.
You have hope. You just say, okay, forget it. Well, I'm doomed.
Right, and to me, when I just go with the King David, one of the most powerful things about King David is that when Nathan comes to him and says, look what you have done, he says, I sinned. How many kings and queens of the world today, or presidents or prime ministers, have ever said, I sinned, I made a mistake, okay? And that's the greatness of David. Yes, he sinned because he's mortal, but he was able to recognize his sin. And he was able to write psalms about his sin. And that's how I look at it. But there are people who say, no, can't do that. But okay, for that reason, there's apples and oranges. And, anyway. So any other questions before we move on? Okay.
I just want to say you did a great job. You did exactly what I asked you in the letter. And I said, I want to know about this pleading.
Yeah.
And can we look at that we can plead like that? You can. Excellent.
Thank you. Wow, thank you so much. All right, anyway, so we don't have that much time. I want to very briefly say something about our work at Christian Friends of Israeli Communities. What has developed into a lot of teaching like this and a lot of work that we're doing on relationships between Christians and Jews and Bible study and all that, that is really a byproduct of what our work is, and our thrust and the goal of our work is to talk about Israel and to talk about Judea and Samaria, the area otherwise referred to as the West Bank, an area that the world looks at and says, oh, Israel doesn't belong there. Israel is illegally occupying the land. And what we're doing is we're going to Christians all over the world and we're teaching the truth. The truth both biblically, which I'm sure you all know. You know that God promised the land to Abraham. I don't have to tell you that. But connecting that biblical truth with the history of the past 50 or 100 years and the reality in Israel today. Some of you have been with me in Israel, and I know Linda, every time she brings a tour, and you brought a lot of tours in the last decade or so. We always are there to provide a program, to schedule their time in Judea and Samaria, and we're doing this for tour groups from all over the world. We have our own tours as well, usually once a year. In 2019, we're going to have 2 tours, but one of them I have the information on already, which is out there. And we're doing whatever we can to get people to have a more fundamental understanding of what is Judea and Samaria, why are the settlements there, why they're legitimate. And we also give Christians the opportunity to provide financial support, not only for our educational work, but also, and even more importantly, to help the people in the land. We are working with a whole host of people and needs in communities throughout Judea and Samaria. And in a few minutes, we'll see a film that will tell you more about that. But I must, before I go, just give you a quick overview historically. If some of you are not familiar, if some of you know this already, go to sleep. Now's the time to take a break. But I gave you these brochures. Take them home, read them. Really, there's a lot of information. But I need to just show you this map, because this map will just make sure we're all on the same page. It's in this brochure. You have the map. Just open it. And this is a map of the center of Israel. We have Jerusalem here, and the Mediterranean Sea, Tel Aviv, the Dead Sea, the Jordan River is here along Israel's eastern border. Here in the middle of the land, we have an area surrounded by a green line. That line represents the pre-67 lines. When Israel became a state in 1948, it was immediately attacked on all sides by 5 Arab countries, way outnumbering Israel with real armies. Israel had no army until that minute, had no army, suddenly had to have an army and fight a war all at the same time. And that's when I talk about the natural coming together with the supernatural. I mean, yes, everybody picked up arms, and there were people scouring America and Czechoslovakia for arms to be smuggled in, because I don't know if you know, America imposed an arms embargo against Israel when Israel became a state. Like insane. And so, yes, they were doing all this, but come on. You have to be a moron not to realize that it was miraculous that these people survived and Israel came into existence. But we didn't have this part, though. And there's only so much, so many miracles you can rely on here. In 1949, there was a ceasefire, which basically just represented where the army stopped. Jordan was here, and north, west, and south is the state of Israel. Now, this area here is the heart of biblical Israel. This is the area we call Judea and Samaria. Judea south of Jerusalem, Samaria north of Jerusalem. And right here, near Shechem, we have the community called Elon Moreh, which is Hebrew for the Oak of Moreh. That's where God first promised the land to Abraham. We have Hebron here, which is the first place that Abraham bought real estate. I like to call it the first Jewish purchase of real estate in the land of Israel. These areas and more that are so biblically significant were completely off limits to Jews from 1948 to 1967. And even so, Israel would never have attacked Jordan to get that land, even though it was so central to who we are and to what our biblical heritage is. But in 1967, Jordan attacked Israel from here as part of a concerted attack joining Egypt and Syria. And Israel then not only repelled the attack, but drove the Jordanians east of the Jordan River, which is where they've been ever since. And we then had this land back. And right after that war, there was a lot of first of all, an outpouring of amazing joy, particularly Jerusalem, which until that point, Israel was not in the old city of Jerusalem. We weren't in north or east or south Jerusalem, only a little part in the west. And also, again, had no access to our holiest sites in Jerusalem. But right after that war, suddenly everybody was going to the Western Wall and the Temple Mount, the old city, and it was just amazing. But people were also going to Shechem and Hebron and Bethlehem and Bethel and all these places from the Bible, which had been completely off limits. But then the next step was, do we settle? And the government didn't want to make a decision, because they were thinking at that point, maybe we need to hold this land as a bargaining chip, and if we offer some of it to the Arabs, maybe in exchange for this land, they will give us peace. Well, the Arabs immediately said no peace, no recognition, no treaties, nothing, leave us alone, we hate you, we're going to, do whatever we can to regroup and try it again next time. And so the government sat on it and it did nothing. But it was a group of young people, already starting right a few weeks after the war, 1967, that said, no. And go back to Ezekiel 36. It's this idea, Here God opened the doors and enables us to go to the mountains of Israel. What are we doing? Sitting in Tel Aviv and waiting for God to bring down the houses from the heavens? It doesn't work like that. You got to do something. God has opened the doors. That's the call, And so they understood that, and they started going through those doors. And initially, it was a struggle, because the government was afraid of international pressure, and the government didn't know what they wanted. But little by little, they succeeded, and they created the community of Kfar Tzion in Judea, and then Hebron in Judea. But it wasn't until 1974 that things really took off. A community of Kedumim was founded in Samaria at the end of 1975. The real turning point happened in 1977, when Menachem Begin became prime minister. And then he was a man of faith who totally subscribed to this idea of the settlement movement. This is our land that God has given us. It is our land legally, it is our land historically, it is our land biblically, and there's no other people that have a right to control this land and settle this land than the Jewish people. Now, we never came in with an intention or practice of throwing out the Arabs. There's plenty of land for everybody. We went from the beginning to settle the barren hilltops where the Arabs never settled because they couldn't figure out how to get the water up there. And that's where we went, and that's where we settled. And thanks to Menachem Begin, that became official government policy in 1977. What began as a handful of people, nobody, not a single Jew living in the land before June middle of June of actually before August of 1967. Today, we are close to 450,000 Jews living in Judea and Samaria. And it's amazing. Yes, you can clap. It's amazing. And that's really what we're celebrating, and this is what we're teaching about. And it's not easy because even to this day, when the people talk about boycotting Israel, when they talk about condemning Israel, they're always focusing on the so-called settlements. And they're always presenting us as being colonizers and illegal occupiers, when in fact, we're coming back to our homeland. And we're settling the area that was designated for us from the very beginning. And frankly, the first to designate that land to us was God. And that counts a lot. Anyway, that's what we're about. And I just want to show this film before we go too long, okay? And this will tell you more about our work. And I hope all of you will decide to join us and get involved. Thank you.
One more time, can we thank Sondra for